First of all, many thanks for coming this evening. I'm Myles. I'm the historian of science here at the Institute for Advanced Study, and I'm the master of ceremonies for tonight's show. So you all lucked out. We're trying something new and bringing two things together. One you know very well, the Edward T. Cohen Concert Series, which is masterfully run by Alex Day. And it turns out that the other thing is my work. For way too much of my life, I've been interested in the historical relationships between science, technology, and music. And it was Alex Day's idea wonderful idea, to bring the two together. Bring together a book talk with musicians, and wonderful musicians at that. So she and Alex grew, and Alex was the most organized human being I ever met in my life, and I've worked with Germans, so that's saying something. They've done both amazing work in bringing this together. Susan Olsen has been great at organizing the event. Dario Mastroianni and his team, I don't mean the Miami Dolphins, but his team of technical support. I thank them wholeheartedly. I think this evening will go amazingly well, and if it does, all of them get the credit and kudos. If you're not happy, it's my fault, and David already said he'd fire me and put me out of my misery. So it's a win-win for everybody, really. I also wanted to announce that the Jasper String Quartet returns to Wolfensohn Hall tomorrow evening, which is Saturday, the 1st of March at 7 p.m. This time it's part of the concert series, the aforementioned concert series, Edward T. Cohen concert series. The evening's musical performances will be influenced by my book, Broadcasting Fidelity. It'll include performances of works by Paul Hindemith, Graziana Beratsevich, and Ludwig van Beethoven that were excerpted tonight. And so if you haven't signed up, please sign up and come to that concert here tomorrow at 7 o'clock. And so without further ado, I'll start the show. Whoops. So I'll start being a historian and telling a story, because that's really what historians are supposed to do best. Today, if we turn on a radio, we can hopefully tell the difference between a cello and drums. If you can't, you've come to the wrong lecture. In 90 minutes, I'll be at the Rubenstein Commons, and the first round is on you. So if you want to leave now, that's fine. But the fact that we can differentiate rather easily between drums and a cello belies the amount of intellectual and manual labor and amazing amount of capital from governments as well as industries to make radio as good as it's become. And it's in the 1920s and 1930s where that work was most evident. So being the historian, I'm now going to go back in time. Let's say exactly 100 years to make the math easier. 28th of February, 1925. I know I'm not supposed to go too far. I move around because moving targets are harder to hit. And when you get to be my size, every bit counts. So I'm not allowed to go if you see me go beyond that line, Alex, you gotta say, Myles, come back, okay? And if I go too quickly, if I speak too quickly, momentum is mass dependent. Love to say, slow down. I'm not German, and this is not a German lecture, so you're allowed to talk to the speaker. It's fine, all right? So it's February 1925, and radio is fairly new in Germany. It's fairly new worldwide. It's in Berlin, the first city that has radio in Germany. It's only a little over a year old. We're sitting in front of this funny contraption in the living room. We're a family of four, which would be a typical bourgeois German family at the time. And we have headsets. We're probably putting our headsets into the radio, or if we're richer, we have a loudspeaker. The loudspeakers are not that good, and we'll talk about loudspeakers a little bit later on in the show. And you're listening to Beethoven, because that's what you do in the 1920s. One of the things you do in the 1920s in Berlin. People are laughing because they know what I mean. You're listening to the violins of the third movement of Beethoven's Eroica, for example, the Allegro molto. And that's a fast piece, and they're pretty high. And all of a sudden you think, wow, that sounds like flutes. What in the world is going on? I mean, Beethoven had flutes, but not playing where the violins are supposed to be playing. It turns out that in the 1920s, tone color, Timbre or Klangfarbe in German, was very difficult to broadcast with any degree of fidelity. What in the world is tone color? Let's stay in 1925. I ask a musician, and they'll pretty much still tell you the same today, and they'll say it's the quality of the sound, right? What differentiates a cello I play the cello, so I'm going to be a bit partial to the cello because it is the most noble of instruments. There we go, extra credit. Well, that's right, David too. And so I lost my train of thought. No. So a cello and say a flute, or equally importantly, it differentiates between Anna Trepka's voice from Renee Fleming's voice, right? Both instruments and voice. And also, so that's what tone goes. What if we ask a physicist? Physicist is going to say, well, that's nice, but hey, we can really do this. And the physicist in 1925 will say, well, Hermann von Helmholtz. When in doubt, I always tell my students the answer is Hermann von Helmholtz. Germany's doyen, 19th century doyen of physics and physiology, wrote a very influential piece called Was ist Klangfarbe, a very typical German title, What's Tone Color? And he said tone color of a note is the ratio of amplitudes of the upper partials of that note. What in the world does that mean? The fundamental frequency of a pitch is what the pitch of the tone is, the fundamental tone. There are exceptions to that, by the way. Again, if we turn to the cello, it would be 220, the open A string in equal temperament. The upper partials, the first harmonic is going to happen at 2 times that, or 440. The third, I'm going past the offsides, 5-yard penalty. The next one will be 660, then 880, then 1010. And the relative ratios, volumes of those upper partials make it a cello, or make it a flute, or make it, I won't say drums, because drum has inharmonics in there as well. But that's what timbre is, Klangfarbe is, a tone color is. And Georg Schünemann, who is the rector of the Berlin Conservatoire, says orchestral pieces were distorted by the radio, such that in one piece the basses seemed to be absent. It didn't have the volume for the lower notes. In another, the drums. The violin sounded like clarinets or flutes. And the concert piano sounded like an old square piano. The lower pitches of the cello sounded like horns. And the sounds of percussion instruments, particularly the timpani, would often shrivel away to a faint bang or a dry, short beat with an imprecise pitch. Radio listening in the 90s was not all that fun. And we're going to kind of give you an idea of what radio of the 1920s did to broadcasts later on in the show. If we stick in 1925, there are fascinating things going on. It's a good year for Bordeaux, and it's a good year for physics and physiology and radio. That rhymes, I can make a song out of that. There are debates about tone color. Is it static or is it dynamic? i.e., does it change over time? Turns out it changes over time. There's the attack, the sustain, and the decay. It's called the envelope of sound. They were realizing that in the 1920s. Also, psychologists and physiologists are saying, yeah, it's also how we perceive tone, right? It's something human about it, right? So you have the leading psychologist of the period, Karl Stumpf, great name, who is the director of the Institute for Psychology in Berlin, working on psychology and perception of tone color, and his colleague Wolfgang Köhler, professor of psychology at the University of Berlin. Now, it turns out it's not just Germany. I can read these, the bad transmissions of relative tone color in Italy, in France, in the Netherlands, in Great Britain, and in the United States. And it's not just musical instruments, it's voices as well, particularly operatic voices, particularly sopranos. So this is from a quote of Scientific American, so it must be true, of October 1928. Not so long ago, an elderly gentleman whose aristocratic appearance was impaired by a distinct frown entered a radio store and addressed the clock as follows. Think Charles Emerson Winchester, the third of Match, right? You sold me a receiver some time ago. I wish you would send someone to my home to fix my set. I hear nothing but screeching sopranos. Here is my address. Thank you. That's actually a very common phenomenon. Again, where there's radio, there you have that phenomenon. And this is the excerpt of, I'm not making this up, I'm not making any of this up, I swear. Right? So this is Why is a Radio Soprano Unpopular, written by John Ryder, who was an electrical engineer, wrote a number of texts on electrical engineering and on radio and radio building. And he talks about that. And what are some of the causes? The first bit, clearly technological. The best broadcasting stations in the United States at the time, some like in New York had some really good ones that didn't distort the sounds that much. Most of them had massive distortions of of the broadcast. The radio sets, the radio receivers that you bought were not so great. They would introduce bandwidth distortions, other types of distortions. And microphones, amplifiers, and loudspeakers are all not that great in the 19th. Amplifiers of the three were probably the best. They've been around the longest. Microphones are being improved upon. New ones are being invented, as well as loudspeakers, precisely because of the popularity of radio, right? And precisely because of the popularity of the radio, there's another reason why sopranos suffer the most. And that is a governmental political decision that affects the technology. As radio becomes very popular throughout Europe and in the United States, speed okay? Slow down, go faster. We can go like vroom. We happy? Touchdown. Yeah, no, wait till the end to clap. No, just kidding. Clap anytime you want. And so if you have too many stations that are loud and close to each other, that overlap in frequencies, you're going to have interference, or as the physicists say, heterodyning. Right? You don't want that. So the government put band restrictions on radio stations, right? The band frequency in the United States, the bandwidth was 10,000 hertz, right? In Europe it was 9,000. Because of this is amplitude modulation, the side bands are what will convey because it's plus and minus 9 plus the carrier tone. That's physics, that's a later lecture. Don't worry about this. Anything above 4,500 hertz could not be broadcast with any degree of fidelity. A soprano's high C in equal temperament, give or take a hertz, is about 1046. That means the fourth upper partial and above does not get broadcast. That's why sopranos sound flat and dull. What's going on in the 1920s? There's cabaret, that's always great. You had the creation of public radio. United States, it's 1920. As I said before, Germany, it's 23. The creation of Fidelity is very important and begins to happen by the late 1920s. You also have a creation, and that's what I find really fascinating, of a physics discipline, electroacoustics. Erwin Meyer, who as the name sounds is German, one of the leading acousticians of the 20th century, said, look, we have electroacoustics because we need to solve the problems of radio. So that's a perfect example of a scientific discipline being created, the usefulness of useful knowledge, being created in order to solve the problems that radios posed. It's also the time of a new musical genre, Rundfunkmusik, radio music, which is not just about music you hear on the radio, it's about music that's composed precisely for the radio and only the radio. A recording or broadcasting studio in a radio ain't like a 19th century concert hall. The acoustics of that room is very different. What types of pieces will work? How many instruments do you need? Where should they be arranged vis-a-vis the microphone? These are critical questions. In the 1920s, you have leading musicians say we'll never be at a point where we can broadcast a symphony over radio. A radio can't handle it. So Rundfunkmusik was a genre that was invented in the 1920s precisely to deal with the limitations of radio. And the aesthetic is Neue Sachlichkeit, new objectivity. I don't like that translation, but that's what it gets translated as. It's an art movement that many people know about in the 1920s. It's also a musical movement that's not as well known. And it's about order, it's about precision, it's about music that's anti-expressionist, it's about tinkering with machines. A number of the composers we're going to talk about today, including Hindemith, love to have machines in his compositions. And there's also a political message. This is the world of Weimar Republic, lefty Germany, Deutschland. And so usually the composers had a political motif in their compositions. So where is this going on? I love writing German words on the board because most other languages need a paragraph. Germans put it together in a word and say, that's it. Good luck with it. It's called Rundfunkversuchsstelle, which generally translates to the radio research station or laboratory. Where is it going on? It's in Berlin. I'm going to call it RVS, otherwise this lecture becomes 40 hours. It opens on the 3rd of May in 1928 in the Berlin Conservatoire, in the attic of all places. And the amazing thing about this laboratory is that it's the home of collaborations between physicists and radio engineers. That's kind of like, duh, that's not that exciting. Physiologists, because of voice over the radio, and musicians. And of all the laboratories, including Bell Labs, that are interested in radio fidelity, this is the only one in which a laboratory is housed in a conservatoire. That's a fascinating point, methinks, right? Who are these composers? I've already mentioned Paul Hindemith, the Austrian composer Ernst Toch, Hindemith experiments in the RVS. He's a professor of music and composition in the Berlin Conservatoire. Ernst Toch experiments with Hindemith in the RVS. Max Butting is on the board. And Kurt Weill, famous for, oh, der Haifisch, der Hai. I'm not going to sing, that's like yelling fire in a crowded theater. But Kurt Weill is Brecht's sidekick. He's fascinated by this laboratory. All of these people contribute to Rundfunkmusik and are a part of Neue Sachlichkeit. The one person who isn't, but is still interested in the RVS and visits it, is Schönberg, right? There are a number of intellectuals in Germany in the 1920s, before 1933, so we're fine. Bertolt Brecht, if Weill is playing along, you have to assume Brecht is. Christmas Day 1927, right before the RVS opens, several months, half a year before it opens, he writes, "This is perfect." And he sees this as a way to have clear reception and broadcasting of the debates that go in the Reichstag in order to say, this is openness. We want people to hear what's going on. We might want to use that today. Walter Benjamin, everyone knows as the author of the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. It gets cited ad nauseum. Not everyone who cites it reads it. That's a later essay, that's 1935. What a lot of people don't realize, in the 1920s, he's writing fairy tale stories for radio for children. He's writing Hörspiele, radio dramas. He's writing short stories for the radio. He's fascinated by radio. Theodor Adorno is incredibly interested in radio. Again, he's actually writing about radio when he's the editor of Anbruch in Vienna. And famously, here in Princeton, he's here from 1938 till 1941, working on the Princeton Radio Project, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, which is to study the effects of mass media on culture and education. Radio is the main theme. And he famously writes an essay in English where he says, tone color is, Klangfarbe is sound color. So I'm like, what in the world is sound color? Okay, it's Klangfarbe in English. He wrote it in English. And this is in the early 1940s. He says, the problem with the Americans, there are a lot of them, but the one is that they really think they are listening to Beethoven when they hear a symphony on the radio. They're not. It's ridiculous to say that, because Beethoven plays with tone color, have one set of instruments playing, and then give that same theme to another set. And you can hear the difference in tone. That's part of the brilliance of Beethoven. Also the volume, the range of the volume, that's difficult to capture. So Americans, if you want to listen to Beethoven, go to the concert hall, not the radio. So even as late as the 1940s, people are complaining about radio reception and tone color. Alfred Döblin is probably the least known to you. He is very much interested in radio. He is the author of Berlin Alexanderplatz, which is a great work. Still happy with the tempo? Touchdown. I love football. What were the goals of this place? It was to test and improve microphones, amplifiers, and loudspeakers, precisely because of the importance of radio. Teach students. I mean, it's not easy when the first time you perform it, back certainly in the 1920s, to perform in front of a microphone. Where do you sit? Where's the cellist sit vis-a-vis the violinist? And where does the horn sit? Because they can't be near the microphone. And if you're too close and you play a bow, you don't want to hit them. It's really fascinating. And you have the rise of what's called Raumakustik, or room acoustics, at this time, that study the dimensions of rooms and where various instruments and the microphone should be played. It's also to contribute to this new genre of radio music. It's also to scientifically determine how radio distorts voices and instruments and how that can be corrected. And it also is supposed to invent electric. We would now say electronic. Electronic usually comes in much later, World War II. You sometimes hear it earlier, but in the 1920s they're saying electric musical instruments. And my favorite is the trautonium. And that's what the second part of the show is going to be about, because as I like to say, it is probably the most famous instrument you've heard, but never heard of. So now you can take a nap and fall asleep tonight, wake up for the musicians, because that's when I'm going to be awake, and I'll wake up to tell you what I mean, because I think you'll actually know what the trautonium is by the end of the show. There aren't many photographs of the RVS. This is one of them from the founding year, 1928. Now, the $64,000 question, and one of the things that got me interested, because people say, how do you get interested in projects? I was trained as a natural scientist, for all my sins, of which there are many, and then I was visited by 3 ghosts and say, I'm going to mess with your brain. You're going to be an historian now. Watch out for the 3rd ghost. He messes you up. And I say, how is it that a scientist measures tone color? Right? I know how musicians, but how in the world do you measure the upper partials of a note? It wasn't clear to me. Then the related question is, I'm fascinated by it is because it's a scientific quantification of aesthetic quality. And that always fascinated me. Because a scientist will say, okay, you think it's an oboe, someone else might think it's a flute. I'm a scientist, I want to know what the frequency patterns of the note actually is. And it raises interesting questions that I dealt with in the book. What happens when you have Paul Hindemith? I never met Paul Hindemith, I'm not that old, but I presume he had a good ear. There were things that Hindemith could hear that was not detected on the device. A lot of things are called combination tones, which are actually a product of the human ear. And there are times when the device showed that there was something there that Hindemith didn't hear. So what happens in that world where science and the musician have disagreements? It's really fascinating. That's the instrument that answers all my, not all of them, but the major part of the question. Harmonic or frequency analyzers. Very little has been written on this, which is amazing to me how important they are. It was actually invented by Lord Kelvin in 1878 to measure the change in pressure and temperature of a location over a long period of time. It was the first one really built was by Henrici, who was a professor of mathematics. I waved to Helmut, professor of mathematics at the University of London. This particular model was built by Carradi, who was a Swiss instrument maker, scientific instrument in Zurich. And it was used by Dayton Miller. Dayton Miller is a professor of physics at what's now called Case Western Reserve University. And he wanted to use he worked with, I have Morley in there. Whoops. I'm always terrible with buttons because I'm not wearing my glasses. Morley, as in Michelson and Morley, for those that are physicists, it is the ether drift experiment. So that's what Dayton Miller is interested in. He's interested in wave motions because the idea is that light is a wave in the late 19th century. But he's also saying, okay, sound is a wave. So I want to be able to measure the tone color of various flutes at first because he's a flautist. So he compares the tone colors using that machine, which is now at Case Western Reserve in the museum, to talk about the types of flutes that Theobald Böhm, a famous flute maker and flautist in Bavaria, the early 19th century, versus ones today. And he also did other instruments. By the 1930s, harmonic or frequency analyzers become really, really, really important, particularly for musical instrument production. Steinway uses these instruments, has physicists on board to study these things, to determine the tone color of the piano, see how it can be improved. This is an electric one, typical of the mid-1930s. S&H stands for Siemens and Halske, which is now just Siemens, one of the leading electrotechnic companies in the world. And with that, it's time that I'm going to have the performers come up. It's now my pleasure to welcome the Jasper String Quartet, featuring violinist Jay Freivogel and Karen Kim, violist Andrew Gonzalez, and cellist Rachel Henderson Freivogel to the Wolfensohn stage. Please join me in welcoming them. So the quartet is going to play the fourth movement of Ludwig van Beethoven's String Quartet in F minor, Opus 95, followed by the fourth, fifth, and sixth movements of the Reinaldo Moya's, I'm hoping I get the Spanish right, Pájaros Garabatos. Is that close for government work? Touchdown. Maria? Thank you. Grazie. Following each live performance, first the Beethoven and then the Moya, we shall play a recording of the Jasper String Quartet performing an excerpt of that same piece, but we put it through a low-pass filter, which means this is basically what radio does to broadcast in the 1920s. I'm not saying I'm now recreating the Berlin experience of 1920 because historians would shoot me, and rightfully so. What I am saying is, because I mean, obviously this is not a bourgeois, living room. Our microphones and amplifiers and loudspeakers are really good now, but it gives you kind of hints at what radio does and why people said that, the violins didn't sound that great and sopranos seemed to screech. So the idea is, as you listen, consider the contrast in sound between the live performance and the recording. See if you can hear the difference. If you cannot, my book sales will plummet exponentially. So don't feel any pressure. So first again, it will be the Beethoven, then the clip, then Moya, and then the clip. More in part 2 of the lecture following the performance. Many thanks.
We'll now hear an excerpt of that Beethoven passed through the low-pass filter. It's shocking. Please join me in welcoming the amazing soprano Maria Brea to the stage to join us in Reynaldo Moya's Pájaros Garabatos. Thank you so much, Maria. It's so beautiful. So now we'll hear what the low-pass filter does to the soprano voice in this excerpt.
Many thanks again, Jasper Quartet. That was absolutely wonderful. And they'll return to the stage at the end of the second part of the show. First part, I talked about radio. And the foibles, and hopefully you heard, I'm assuming many of you heard the distinction between the live and the recorded, and the broadcast. If not, like I said, book sales are going to be a disaster. So Eric Crahan from Princeton University Press is here, so I apologize in advance. There are critical similarities between the trautonium and the radio. One is the fact that most of the early we now call electronic musical instruments were invented by radio engineers. The most famous one of the period probably is the theremin by Theremin, the Russian-Soviet Leon Theremin, cellist and electrical engineer. It's for those that watch Star Trek. I'm old, so the original one with the original Spock, the original Captain Kirk is woo. That's the theremin. Friedrich Trautwein, who's the inventor of the trautonium, helped construct the first German radio station in Berlin in 1923. The material culture is very similar. You have circuits and resistors, capacitors, thyrotrons, which is a radio signaling device, low-pass filters. You could actually hook up a trautonium to a radio, the speaker, so it could project the sound. Perhaps most importantly, the trautonium was constructed so that it could mimic various acoustical instruments, such as the cello, such as the flute, such as the bassoon, such as the clarinet. It's also the first electronic musical instrument built purposely to mimic the envelope of sound. It's actually not the Hammond organ, it is the trautonium. That's why it was so good at mimicking a number of acoustical instruments. It can also produce original futuristic sounds. And this flexibility of the trautonium, either to imitate or to create, explained its longevity throughout various periods with rather very different political ideologies. And radio is the same. On the one hand, radio is supposed to imitate, if you have violins being broadcast, the radio should be able to mimic that sound through the broadcast. On the other hand, it's supposed to be inventive, because remember, Rundfunkmusik was supposed to be about creating new types of music for the radio. Same with the trautonium. It should, on the one hand, mimic acoustical instruments, on the other hand, create new futuristic modern sounds. It's a scientific instrument to test theories of how speech sounds and musical sounds are generated. So how does it work? It has, and here we're going to try, here we go. There's a wire right there that went above a metal rail that when pressed produces an electric circuit, produces a sound. Those dials and switches create the tone colors, right? And that's a pedal for volume. So scientifically, how does it work? Basically, you have the fundamental tone, the fundamental frequency that's produced by a glow discharge lamp, a neon bulb, because that's very rich in upper partials. You also have other resonant circuits that are tuned to different frequencies via low pass filters, and they generate the formants. And the formants are the upper partials that give the characteristic tone to the instrument. It's actually, the tone is produced by subtractive synthesis, so it has low pass filters. For those that know the more modern, it's like synthesizers, for example, like the Moog, that's additive synthesis. And also inharmonic frequencies are used by the trautonium. That is Friedrich Trautwein, the inventor, someone with whom I would not have a drink, even if he were to buy the booze. I turned out not liking the human being at all. He studies physics at Heidelberg. He has musically trained, studies physics at Heidelberg, switches to law, becomes an assessor, works for the telegraph company, which is part of the post office, which is also becomes radio, is a part of the post office in Germany. He leads a radio squadron in World War I. After the war, he comes back and finishes his PhD, his D engineer, Doctor of Engineering, in Karlsruhe in electrical engineering relevant to radio manufacture. And he went tinkering at the RVS with the trautonium in the early 1930s. He notices that he can produce vowel sounds. It's like, wow, this is interesting. So his assistant, Oskar Zahler, who's the Hindemith student, gets Hindemith to come up to the attic and say, wow, look at what we're able to do. And Hindemith says, you know, there's a relationship between vowel sounds and musical instruments. And so they start tinkering. U in a bassoon, O sounds like a clarinet, A an English horn, E, these are all German vowels by sounds. E in the oboe, several shades of the vowel A can give you the saxophone. A mixture of U and E can give you the cello, and a mixture of A and I can give you the violin. Now, he's an electrical engineer, so he's interested in comparing oscillograms. What are oscillograms? Sexy term for what was recorded with a harmonic analyzer. That's an oscillogram. So we have, for example, the oscillograms of vowel and consonant sounds produced by Trendelenburg of Siemens and Hauske, also at the University of Berlin. There are violin oscillograms by Backhaus. There are other scientists working on oscillograms of other instruments. And so what Trautwein does is he writes in electric music, we now say electronic music, a comparison of the resulting vibrational forms of the trautonium's formants, again, the upper partials that give the characteristic tones, with the characteristic oscillograms of musical instruments and speech sounds reveal a noticeable conformity. The trautonium is linking physiology of speech with how musical sounds are created. And he writes further in his work, the trautonium is an electrical analogy of the mechanism of sound creation of the human speech organs and musical instruments. The scientific significance lies in the physico-physiological impression of the synthetically generated sounds compared with the timbre of numerous musical instruments and speech sounds. This suggests that the physical processes are related in many cases. And right down here, you have it's the circuit for the physico-physiological fundamental experiment. That's the circuit that's going to give rise to the trautonium. Now, for those that are dying scientists that are dying to find out, it'll be one slide on science and I'll switch to music, so I promise it won't be that boring, right? Speech sounds, the argument is, were produced by intermittent puffs of air. Goes through the lungs, the glottis opens and closes, the pulses that go to the oral cavity initiate eigenfrequencies, oh, we're getting sexy now, and transients, which are damped and decay. They are the formants. They are the characteristics of speech or singing. For musical instruments, you blow into air, producing pulses. You bang keys on a piano, producing pulses. You bow a stringed instrument, producing pulses. And they'll produce these eigenfrequencies that are damped and decay and form the tone colors. For the trautonium, the tones are produced by what's called impulse or shock excitation, which is actually a technique invented by Telefunken, the radio company that sponsors the trautonium, I'll talk about in just a second, for producing a damped alternating current in radio. It's a very, very important technique. It's an ephemeral oscillation discharge from a primary circuit to a secondary circuit with an antenna. The vibrating antenna creates a sound. That sound is damped and decays and forms a formant. So once again, the trautonium is seen as the electrical analog of the voice organ and musical instruments. Now you're saying, Myles, shut up, we want to hear this thing. So this is the part of the show where you hear this thing. This is thanks to YouTube, so we all give a shout out to YouTube. This is the first ever recording of the trautonium from June 1930 at the RVS. The Conservatoire in Berlin hosts the Neue Musik Berlin, which is a music festival that featured numerous electronic musical instruments, of which the trautonium was the hit. And so this is Oskar Zahler, Hindemith's student, who's playing. He's very young. He plays it all the way up to the 1990s. He dies in 2002, I believe. So when he turns a dial or flips a switch, he's changing the tone color, and he's going to imitate the strings of an orchestra, right? And notice that the type of trautonium, this is the archetypal, the first one, it resembles, he's playing it like a stringed instrument. It's just horizontally rather than vertically.
Ich möchte Ihnen nunmehr das Trautonium vorführen.
Switch formants. That's kind of impressive. You're saying, Myles, we came all the way this distance to hear that. That's not that impressive. It's going to get really good in a few years, and I'll show you the later versions. It had mixed reviews that I'm happy to talk about. I talk about in the book. This is an iconic picture. I know 3 out of the 4 people there. I'll buy a beer to anyone who knows who the violinist is. I have no idea who it is. But the guy I'm not a big fan of, Trautwein, is there. That's Hindemith, the composer in the bow tie, and that's Oskar Zahler, his student, and again, the most famous trautonium player ever. Hindemith actually composes a piece, and the first piece for trautonium is composed by Hindemith. This is actually from Trautwein's electronic music of 1930, and in the lower corner here it says, an attempt or a trial of a composition for Dr. Trautwein's electrical instrument, Paul Hindemith. And we actually have the recording. That's the first page of Hindemith's 7 pieces for 3 trautoniums, still 1930. Not bad, eh? They worked because it had mixed reviews, but Telefunken, that electronics company, thought this is a way in which we can make money. We're going to make it into a household instrument, Hausmusik in German. And it's the Volkstrautonium, the Trautonium of the people, and of the funny, interesting dials. You can see it's the one manuals there for the hands. 8, 9, and 10, F, R, and K, L. Those are the bits that change the formants and the tone colors. It's invented in 1932. It's marketed in 1933. And this is kind of your happy Schmidt family in Germany, bourgeois Germany. Hausmusik, imitation is the key. I can't see what they're playing, but it would be kind of like a Bach or Beethoven piece. There's Daddy playing the Trautonium. That's the radio. It's hooked up to the radio as the speaker, as I mentioned. The cellist, the daughter, I don't know if that's an older daughter or the wife, playing the piano. Now, you'd be looking at the date, and you're seeing it's 1934, 1935. You're going, when did Hitler come to? I can save you the screen time. You don't have to Google. 30th of January, 1933. It's the Third Reich, right? So when I started on the project, I'm like, this is great, because the Nazis are going to hate this stuff. But they don't. They love the Trautonium is the hit for electronic music. Because I would have thought it was entartete Musik, which is degenerate music. I'm not making that phrase up. There was also entartete Kunst, degenerate art, which was a list of the artwork and music that the Nazis did not want. By the way, on that list was Paul Hindemith, but not the Trautonium. Indeed, this is the concert instrument. It's one of the instantiations. This is a Volkstrautonium, but there's a second manual there, and it's progressing to become what's called the concert Trautonium. The interesting thing is this is German. It looks like the EKG of someone having a heart attack. So feel for us German historians. But if you look very closely, this is, by the way, from the notebook, a report of the new Trautonium by Oskar Sahle in the archives of the Deutsches Museum. It says right here, das Modell, welches Herrn Minister Dr. Goebbels vorgespielt wurde. It was the instrument that was played in front of Minister Goebbels. Yeah, that one. Joseph Goebbels. 11th of April, 1935. Sahle's playing, and Trautwein is there. There's a pianist and a cellist. They play a Bach sonata, Beethoven trio, an intermezzo by Gensmer. Gensmer was also a composer of the period for the Trautonium, and a movement of one of my favorite composers, Max Reger, a sonata. And they also played new futuristic tones that actually didn't interest Goebbels that much. I have the recording. I won't play. I mean, Sahle speaks a very kind of Thüringen accent. So I'm not going to play it. You don't hear that much of Goebbels. But he says, we haven't heard anything like this before. It's fabulous. Do carry on with it. He wants to know if it can be used for massed rallies. And the answer is it can. Trautwein joins the Nazi Party on the 1st of April, 1933. For those who are German historians, that's the same date that says don't buy at Jewish merchants, kauf nicht bei Juden ein. He assists the Nazi Party in designing acoustical setups, particularly huge loudspeakers for their massive gatherings. Radio broadcasts of the Trautonium could be heard in the commercials of the Berlin Olympic Games of 1936. There are scores of radio concerts, dozens of live performances by Oskar Sahle throughout the Third Reich, many sponsored by and organized by Kraft durch Freude, which is Strength Through Joy programs. That was the Nazi program for leisure events, vacations, concert sponsoring. So the Trautonium is part and parcel of the Third Reich's music world. The next version is the radio Trautonium. It was funded by the Reichs Radio Society, which is totally Nazified. It's also paid for by Telefunken again, and it's housed in the Haus des Rundfunks. For those that lived in Berlin, it's in Masurenallee, not far from the Olympic Stadium, and it actually survived World War II, which is interesting. It actually survived, and that's Sahle playing. On these older versions, Trautwein, these more recent versions, Trautwein does nothing to do with it. He's working on war effort, and Sahle is the only person building these instruments. The Concert Trautonium, which is what the phase right after what Goebbels had seen, this is a good example of that. It's not the Volkstrautonium, as the clip says. The clip is wrong. I actually know the one living, really great Trautonium virtuoso. Shout out to Peter Pichler in Munich, and he says no, it clearly needs two registers. So we think it's the Volkstrautonium. The interesting thing is that this is supposed to mimic an instrument. This is a broadcast of it, and I want you to think what instrument you hear when you hear this. The amazing thing is, you remember the first clip you heard, this is a bit more advanced because it's Paganini. And for those who know Paganini, that ain't Mary Had a Little Lamb. So what instrument do you think that was supposed to be? When I asked the musicians, I can cheat, they said clarinet. Some people say flute. Yep, it's actually a violin. Remember I said violins when broadcast sound like flutes or clarinets, and that's a classic example of that. Isn't it great when this stuff works? It's like Christmas all over. So it becomes an instrument of propaganda in the Third Reich. On the left is a picture of Zala at the concert Trautonium. The radio Trautonium stayed in the Haus des Rundfunks because it's too big to move. This moved about, toured throughout Germany and Europe. That's the Mozart Saal, or the Mozart Auditorium in Vienna, Austria, 1942. This is Utrecht, Holland, February 1941. Again, save your screen time. The Nazis have already occupied the Netherlands. This is the first playing of a clip of the Trautonium outside of Germany. And now for those that that play an instrument, it's a lot more like a keyboard than it is a stringed instrument. Once again, it's Zala playing. Dutch are saying, what? The Nazi aesthetic, there's a famous phrase called Steely Romanticism. It was coined by Goebbels in 1933 in Berlin, in the Philharmonic. And he wanted it to be describe the musical and technological aesthetic that best represented the Nazi party. And it was no longer the aesthetic of Neue Sachlichkeit. The Trautonium was the example par excellence of Steely Romanticism. And critics, music critics throughout the Third Reich commented about how this instrument is the instantiation of Goebbels' desire for Steely Romanticism. The war ends. It's not good to be Trautwein because he was a member of the Nazi party, has problems being employed. Zala never joined the Nazi party, and his career actually does thrive, not initially, but shortly after the war in West Germany. And the thing that's interesting is that it's no longer called upon, it's not good to talk about Steely Romanticism at the end of World War II. It's kind of like Plan B. And now it's used much more to do strange, futuristic music. The classic example is it's used in radio dramas. Paul Dessau is a brilliant composer, a good leftist, escaped Nazi Germany, came to New York, hooked up with a guy called Bertolt Brecht to work on music together, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. He directs Faust I in 1949, the 28th of August, 1949, which is the 200th anniversary of Goethe's birth. And so Paul Dessau, we know, thought really hard about how is it that we remember Goethe, because the Nazis abused him. I mean, Goethe was the German Titanic author. par excellence, but we still love Goethe, we just don't want to do the Nazi stuff, right? So he wants the Trautonium there to kind of jar the audience. So the Trautonium plays the bit of the barking dog. When Mephistopheles enters the Trautonium, the orgy in Walpurgisnacht has the Trautonium, and it's a really fascinating use because he talks a lot to Bertolt Brecht. Indeed, they collaborate on 2 operas together. Dessau writes the music, Brecht the libretto. The first is Die Verurteilung des Lucullus, which is about the Roman general Lucullus, who is in Hades, who killed a lot of people up on earth and has his judgment. And Brecht wanted the Trautonium to produce eerie, foreboding effects and not have the audience either identify with Lucullus or the jury. And that's what the Trautonium did. It was a Verfremdungseffekt, a distancing effect. For those that do literature, you know that Brecht is classic of that. It was also used for instruments in classic works, the Parsifal bells, that used to be the Glockenklavier, which is what Wagner wanted and had produced. So now the Trautonium can do that. It played the bells in Parsifal in the Städtische Oper in Berlin, now called the Deutsche Oper Berlin. It also was used to play the trumpet in the Brandenburg Concerto No. 2 because they couldn't find a trumpet player in this one village very easily, so they used the Trautonium. That's the last example, and the classic example of the Trautonium. Again, only Zala makes it. Trautwein is going to die another 4 years from now. It's 1952. It's his claim to fame. Whoops, there we go. It produces the Parsifal bells in Parsifal and the hammering sounds in Das Rheingold in Bayreuth. This ain't trendy Berlin, man. This is frickin' Bayreuth. Right? And we all know, or many of us know, the relationship between the Wagner family and Hitler. Hitler loved Wagner. Productions of Meistersinger von Nürnberg were ridiculous medieval, monstrosities. Wieland Wagner was a minimalist, right? Precisely because what his family did before. And he was also a fan of Brecht, and he uses the Trautonium again for Verfremdungseffekt. He doesn't want the crowd to sit there and identify with Wagner's characters like they did during the Third Reich, which is really fascinating. It got horrible reviews, and I can honestly say, one of my colleagues actually said after I gave a version of the talk a number of years ago, Glenn Bowersock was actually at one of the performances in Bayreuth when he heard this horrible monstrosity of an instrument, and it was the Trautonium. Dessau and Brecht also team up for Deutsches Miserere, a 3-part opera about Germany, the euphoria of Germany before the war, and the disaster of Germany after the war. It was not performed until 1966. For those that are Brecht fans, that's a decade after he's dead, in Leipzig, in the German Democratic Republic, aka East Germany. You hear the review saying dark tone colors, alienating, disruptive, encourages the audience to think along with it. Classic Verfremdungseffekt. It's also, so now we don't have steely romanticism, we have a new world. It's also the world of capitalism, Western capitalism in particular. It's used for music for industry films, for science companies such as Schöpfung ohne Ende, Creation Without an End, which is Bayer, right? Aluminum, Portrait of a Metal from the aluminum conglomerate in the Rhineland. Steel by Mannesmann, right? So it also plays a prominent role in the documentary film Eine Reise zum Mond, a journey or voyage to the moon, which is about NASA by Manfred Dörniak. And it also plays critical roles in cultural films such as Anders als du und ich, Different from You and Me, 1957, which is the first film that deals seriously about homosexuality in the in West Germany, in the Federal Republic of Germany. Mine's my favorite. This is about capitalism as you get. It's 1950s, you're in a theater in Germany, and you're watching Coca-Cola. Woohoo! And you hear this clip. I'm probably not supposed to say this, but if you're wearing lederhosen, you're not allowed to slap your thighs. Okay, that's all I'm going to say. Otherwise, you can sing along with it. 1950s Coca-Cola commercial with the Trautonium. Again, Oskar Saal is playing.
Und so trat der Gesangverein beim Wirt zum Goldenen Löwen ein.
Herr Wirt, die Kehle ist verdorrt. Wir wollen Coca-Cola haben, und zwar sofort.
Trautonium. It's great. It's also the only musical instrument featured in 2 ballets, and it was taped. So there was tape music of the Trautonium. One was Payen, which was premiered in Theater des Westens in Berlin in 1960. The other one was Electronics, which is actually a fairly well-known ballet, choreographed by none other than George Balanchine, right? I mean, we're not talking Huey, Dewey, and Louie meet Larry, Moe, and Curly for a dance. It premieres at the New York City Ballet, March 22nd, 1961. But most famously, you can wake up now. Remember I said this is probably the most famous instrument you've heard, but never heard of. There's Hitchcock on the left. Hitchcock, a lot of people don't realize, studied engineering when he was young. He was fascinated by technology and often brought technology into his films. He also used technology for film cutting and film splicing, right? And this is a picture of a much older Zala. He's lost his hair. It's December of 1963. And he just finished recording the Trautonium for Hitchcock's new film known as The Birds. Those aren't real birds. You're never going to watch that movie again the same way, are you? That's the Trautonium. So this leads to the second bit of the performance, and it's my pleasure and honor and delight to welcome once again the Jasper String Quartet back on stage. So in this part of the lecture, I talked about the RVS, the laboratory, the emergence of music specifically composed for the radio, of which Paul Hindemith was a pioneer, also the invention of the Trautonium. The quartet will now perform the first and second movements from Paul Hindemith's String Quartet number 4, followed by the first movement of Gracena Bratzevich's String Quartet number 4. The Bratzevich piece was written in 1951. During the post-war era, when Zala developed the finishing touches to the mixture Trautonium. When I return to the stage following the performance, I will conclude with the moral to the story. So, enjoy. Now for the final bit of the show, some of you who know electronic music would have thought that electronic music was invented by the famous studio in Germany, the Studio for Electronic Music in Cologne, which was established in October of 1951. Robert Bayer, Herbert Eimert, who was a composer, and the physicist Werner Meyer-Eppler, famous for being perhaps the most important player in information theory in Germany, as well as being the co-founder of this group. It is rightfully known in history because whoops, I knew that was going to happen, because of Stockhausen, König, and Ligeti worked there. I'm interested because there are interesting fights between the Cologne school on the one hand and Zahler and Trautwein on the other. One was about the authentic manner of composition. Meyer-Eppler, who was not a musician but was a physicist, wanted to bypass performers altogether. So he'd get a sound from a sine tone generator, I'm not making this up, and then introduce things like linear or nonlinear distortions, tape that. It's the importance. He actually thinks that magnetic tape can capture the idea of the composer without being sullied by those performers, right? And then tape the linear, nonlinear distortion, then introduce reverberation, so on and so forth. Luckily for us, Zahler and Trautwein, particularly Zahler, said, that's insane. Zahler played the Trautwein, but also was a composer. And he said, I'll play it and I'll tape a piece and then I'll go back and listen to it and then I'll play another piece and improvise while I listen to that second piece. And then I'll tape those two pieces and improvise a third, so that the notion that there's a distinction between performer and composer is absurd. He actually says the performer is quasi-author. And for those that are the literary types, Roland Barthes famously wrote an essay that reminds me of this, The Death of the Author, in which there is no hegemonic kind of author. The reader has his or her ability to interpret the text. And so, interesting question. Should a performer passively follow the wishes of the composer? What's the role of tape in composing and performing? The Trautonium plays a huge debate to that story. So this talk has raised some interesting, important issues. Because I'm an historian, I don't have a dust fetish. I'm interested to know how it is where we got to where we are today. And so does technology enhance an artist's creativity, or does it replace her or him? There was a debate with the Trautonium. After the war, there was very little money for orchestras, so Zahler and Trautwein marketed by saying, hey, you can save labor, just use my Trautonium. It can be a flute, it can be a clarinet, it can be whatever you want it to be. And that's very similar to the Moog synthesizer much later. A lot of people don't realize that in the late 60s and early 70s, the music union on Broadway banned the Moog synthesizer because it replaced musicians, right? More recently, in April of 2024, there's an open letter signed by 200 musicians on the use of AI. There are a lot of musicians who use AI by now, by the way, for composing as well as performing. And they basically say, look, they've given us some great tools, AI algorithms, but, we'd like to have a job at the end, right? So let's think carefully about this. So I'm interested in that dichotomy and talk to the musicians. So briefly, what do you think about the role of technology enhancing or replacing a performer?
Well, obviously I'm not in favor of that. We very much want to still be performing. There were a couple interesting things you said in there. I thought it was interesting, I can't remember which composer it was who said that they could get the sound directly from their head into
Meyer-Eppler,
yep. Yeah. But I think that a lot of composers, the sound that they hear in their head is of a real person playing an instrument. Yep. So in that sense, all of these electronic instruments, I think they are tools. And sometimes the sound of these instruments is what composers have in their head, and sometimes what they have in their head is the real nuance and life that a performer will bring to the music. Yeah.
I was thinking when we were listening to the trio of Trautoniums, how cool it was, and also, I have to justify myself being a person, right? And what is different about people playing? And it made me think of, a lot of times when we work with composers, they'll send us a MIDI recording of their piece. And we'll get a sense of the notes and the rhythm and dynamics a little bit. But so far, the electronic equivalent of the string instruments, it doesn't capture some of the things we work on a lot, like the development of the sound. Right. And like how our hands work together and how many different combinations of that there are. And also in a string quartet, I'm hopeful, although I'm sure we can program anything, that the string quartet will endure because in our parts, if we just played the notes that were written, it would sound very boring, actually. There's a lot of work that goes into figuring out how our notes relate to each other. And we could program something to know, I'm playing the third of the chord here and it should be slightly low or something like that. But there's also the context of is it the melody, or there's so many things. So I'm hopeful that our training and, the humanity of doing this thing with our hands will endure also, even though it is a very cool tool, as you're saying. It is awesome and cool to play with, too.
Yeah. I mean, one last question on the topic was that my next project is going to be the role of AI in intellectual property debates with musicians, right? And we don't know how that's going to pan out. So one question to you is, is it on your horizon? Are you thinking about this, both in terms of composition and performance? Do you think it's too far off to be worried about? And what would your thoughts be about AI and changing what kind of credit, either literally real capital or symbolic capital, to your to your performances?
It's a very difficult question. And I feel like in terms of music and technology, we're always playing catch up. And there's it's always happening in different ways, right? Like when Napster first came out, and then it's like, what's going to happen with all the music? It's just available online. It's killing record sales, and then you kind of, the landscape changes, people shift, and that's not at the forefront of our thoughts anymore. The same thing happened in the pandemic when all of a sudden everybody, because we couldn't go hear concerts, they rigged out their concert halls for live streaming, and everybody was making videos, and we just put all the content out there for free. And now, it's like it becomes a problem that we have to overcome, and I feel like AI is the next frontier of this. It's interesting because in a way, AI, I think, opens the door for a lot of people to kind of become composers. Like they can feed it a bunch of words and say, like, I want this kind of vibe and this music, and then it'll, they've created something. And in that sense, it's a creative tool that can, I think it could go really interesting places. I do think, the solo string instruments are very difficult to capture, and it's one of the most difficult things for to replicate electronically. So I think it's going to be a while before that happens.
Well, even in the pandemic, when everybody went to, even if you had very high fidelity sound and great video, we thought it was okay until we had the opportunity to come back in person. And then you realized what you were missing. And the experience of being present with other people, hearing their interpretation of the artists who are on stage, hearing how they're taking the music that was written from today or hundreds of years ago and bringing it to life, that human experience was gone. Yeah, so
that's interesting.
I'm actually not, I'm not concerned, but famous last words.
If you want to do a little bit of research for yourself, just listen to any string quartet and listen to them all play the same piece, and you'll notice that they're all just completely different. And I think AI would be extremely hard to replicate that. So it's my...
Which leads to the last question I have for you guys is, when, if at all, may a performer add his or her interpretation to the composition? When is it too much? Beethoven famously used the metronome because he was constantly at war with virtuosi who took liberties with his composition. He believed that, I am Beethoven, it is in my head, and it is your responsibility to play it the way I want it. It's a debate, certainly, that Zala and Trautwein fight in the Cologne school. Is again about imitation versus creativity. And I wanted to ask, what would your response be to Beethoven or any composer who basically says, look, you need to follow, you take our cue and you need to do it as we say?
I mean, when we work with a composer, you know, their words are like gold to us, and it's such a treat to work with a live composer, because then, you know, like it's a mystery. The black dots on the page. What are you going to do with that? And so if it were me talking to Beethoven and he told me play it at this tempo, I'd do it. But you know, I think a lot of performers fall on different, it's like a spectrum, the way people feel about how much of themselves to put into the music, and it's kind of all of our own personal journey. But I also, I think, you know, we're like having this great conversation with the composers through their music, and in a way, when we can't talk to the composers, we're like detectives. We're looking for the clues that they've left us of how they want the music to sound, and that's kind of the best we can do to muddle through.
Yeah, and I think Leon Fleischer said it best when we were working with him, and he said the performer is an alpine guide. You know, the composition is the mountain, and the performer's job is to interpret that and to say, look at this beautiful vista, look at this patch of mushrooms, like, you know, and until the everyday person can take a score and hear a Brahms symphony, then there will always be room for a performer in the world. So that's our job as musicians, is to be able to take the notes on the page, take all of our experience, take the oral history that's been transferred to us, and bring it to life.
Perfect. Does last slide I promised. So what's the end of the story? The end of the story is that the RVS and the Bell Labs did amazing jobs for Fidelity, for AM radio. Then in 1931, a guy called Armstrong invented FM, frequency modulation, vastly increased the sidebands. Fascinating story behind it. It doesn't really catch on, become really popular until the late 50s, early 60s. The ultimate trivia question, the first car in the United States to have an FM radio was in 1963. And it's not until the late 1970s when the number of people listening to FM is greater than the number of people listening to AM. And I think a lot of it has to do with classic rock radio, classic rock albums and stereophonic sounds in the 1970s. Herb Deutsch was the musician who worked with Robert Moog. I had the honor of working with him, and he passed away sadly, I think 2 years ago now, 2 or 3 years ago. He put me onto the story because he said, you know, Moog's subharmonicum, which is a semi-modular synthesizer, was built with the Trautonium in mind, because people always ask me what's the issue with Moog. Kraftwerk, for the old people in the audience like myself, listen to Computerwelt. And there's also, apparently, there's a performance in the area in like 2 weeks. They don't have the original performers, sadly. Florian Schneider Esleben is one of those original members of the band. He wrote an homage for Oscar Zala's 90th birthday. I mean, the argument was, on the one hand, we turn to the Electronic School of Cologne as our parents, but it's really Trautmann and Zala who are the grandparents of what it is we did. So it's a story about the simultaneous construction of radio, of fidelity, of electroacoustics, and musical aesthetics. And what I find, I mean, I'm a material cultural historian, that you can get a bit of material culture, whether it's the radio or the Trautonium, and piece things together historically that other types of histories can't give you. How many times would you get Brecht and Goebbels in the same show talking about something that's the same interest for very different reasons and very different ways, right? So my book, I hope, is a challenge to a preconceived notion of modernity and the 43 billion definitions of modernity. The one I'm challenging is the notion that science is somehow independent of culture, and that, you know, there's nothing from culture that impinges upon science. Disciplinary boundaries in the 1920s were very much blurred. Remember, electrical acoustics existed because of the radio. And I would argue that even today, those disciplines are not as separate as one might think, and I think it's up to the historian to show that. So this is the end. I want to thank, again, the two Alexes, Alex squared, as I call them, Day and Gruen, and Susan Olson and Dario's team, and absolutely, positively, the musician. I came for them. I mean, for the musicians, and also many, many thanks.